Diana Snow from Woombay, Queensland, Australia. And I don't know how I've been talked into this. But I'm here to try and tell you a little bit about how I first met Baba. I first heard about him in 1953 from a friend of mine. We were both in the Rosicrucian order and had been for about 5 years then. That was after I hate this. Say my name again?
No.
Oh,
We
I've done
that.
All right, good. What would you like to know about first?
First, I think that it would be nice to hear about how you heard about Meher Baba originally, even before you met him.
Well, I'd been belonged to the Rosicrucian order for 5 years, and I'd got to the stage where you have to, any further progress has to be made with a master. And I knew all about masters then, and I believed that there were masters on earth, but nothing about Avatar. Especially, anyhow, a friend of mine was staying with me, and she had friends who knew Francis Brabazon.
Yeah.
And one day, just before she left for Canada, she showed me a cutting from a newspaper, the photo of Francis in it, and just a little article saying that he'd just come back from India, where he'd spent some time with someone he asserted, he believed was a perfect master or avatar.
What was your impression of the picture of Francis at that time?
Well, I examined that very closely because I had every intention of meeting him, and I tried to assess whether it would be worthwhile, whether he was the sort of person whose opinion I could believe in, or whether he was just a crank or something. And I liked the face. It was a strong face. It looked intelligent. So when my friend said that she'd been invited to go along and hear him speak about his experience in India, I said, oh, can I come too? And she said, well, I don't know him at all, and this talk is just for his very close circle of friends who already know about Meher Baba. And I'm just sneaking in by the back door, as it were, because I'm leaving Australia next week. So I'll tell you all about it. So when she came home, I was all agog to hear what she thought about it. And she said, well, I said, first of all, what is this Francis Brabazon like? And she said, well, he's undoubtedly sincere. He really believes everything he says and feels about it. And he's intelligent, I'd say, but I wasn't particularly keen. And I said, well, what did you think of what he said about the man, Meher Baba? And she said, well, if I were going to be here, I would probably go into it more. She's waving her hand. Right. And she said if I were staying here, I'd probably want to know more about it, but I'm not sufficiently interested. And I've always thought that was rather funny because I met her through someone else who told me about the Rosicrucians in the first place and wasn't interested in joining herself and went away. And then this Margaret person tells me about my first mention of the word Baba and then goes away and is not interested. So then later on in the next few days I went down and met Francis, and he told me a little about it and said that he'd be in touch. I asked him that I would like to learn more about it, and if he were having any lessons or anything, giving any lessons.
Could you? This was not an this was not.
No, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
This was at Beacon Hill. Francis had just got the foundations of what is now Mayor House, and he was cutting the stone himself. The day I saw him, he was slogging away at the stone, just living in a little rough lean-to with a big long table and rough forms, and he was cutting the stone. It was a very hot day when I walked up to the top of Beacon Hill, and are you Francis Brabazon? Yes, who are you? And I explained the connection. Oh, come and have a cup of tea. So he pumped up the, is this too detailed?
No.
Pumped up the primus and got some cups out and opened the jars and things, and we sat down and had a cup of tea. And then he started to tell me about Barbara, and I had been going through rather a bad patch at the time. Nothing was happening in my life that made me like it, but, just a bad time for a couple of months. And after we talked for a couple of hours, Francis said that, yes, he thought he would be having be giving some talks, probably a short period of talks, and he gave me a little orange booklet, which I still have, Gems, I think it's called, from the teachings of MeherBaba, and said, read this and I'll get in touch with you later on. And as I got up to go, and he shook hands, and he said, as he held my hand, he said, Baba has a saying that he's very fond of quoting to us. He said, don't worry, be happy. And he sort of squeezed mine, and, Francis got a rather forbidding face when he hasn't got his beautiful smile. And, this smile, perhaps the first time during the interview, broke over his face, and don't worry, be happy, with his wide smile. And for the first time for months, I really had a little feeling of sort of life in myself, as if I were coming back to the human race again. And then a couple of weeks later, or a week or so later, I met him in town for coffee, and he told me a little, just seeing him and mentioning Baba's name, And the feeling of recovery had lasted for a few days after the meeting and then faded, and then he was in touch with me again. So that was, I suppose, about a fortnight after I'd been up to Beacon Hill to see him. And I'd already begun to feel a little better, and various, there were some business problems which had never worried me in the past and wouldn't have then. They began to get a little bit better, and then another fortnight went past, I think, and I met him in town for lunch with some more. I remember Reg Paffel was one of them, but that's about all I remember. There were 4 or 5. And then he gave a series of talks at a little room in the city, and there are quite a few of the old ones there. I can remember the Rouses, and May Lundquist wasn't there. I can't remember the others. I remember Lorna and Robert particularly. They were quite young. I think they were married, but of course there was no Radi then. And then we started, very soon after that, the Saturday afternoons at Beacon Hill.
Well, what was the impression at the talks at that time?
I was just fascinated, and the more each time was more and more. Francis would read something, one of the Baba books. There weren't so many then, but some from the discourses mainly, the original 5 copies of discourses, and other bits and pieces. I can't remember what they were. And he would ask if there were any questions, and maybe there'd be a little bit of discussion for it, but he didn't encourage discussion. More,
But you had mentioned earlier that he had seemed very curt at that time.
Oh, well,
even though he was talking about love and...
Yes, well, I don't... that was more I noticed in the Saturday evening classes. There were, I suppose, about 12 of us, an average of 12, some coming and going. And we'd go down Saturday afternoon, and the women would do what they could about burning off rubbish and tidying around the place. This was the building of Mayor House, and Francis had said that he doesn't think that there's any chance that Baba would come there, but he wants to have a place in case it ever entered Baba's head to come to Australia, you see. So he was building this house for him, and the men helped with the stonework and so on and so forth, and we did what we could. That was the afternoon. We had afternoon tea, and then the women had brought sandwiches, or in the winter soup and so on. And as soon as it got dark, we had a bit of tea, and then Francis would go away for a little while we cleared up the food mess, and then he'd come back, and we'd all be sitting at the table, and he would read the monthly letter or another discourse or something, you see, like that. And sometimes people would ask foolish questions, or questions that weren't quite relevant. Francis didn't think, and he'd answer rather curtly, and I was rather shocked at this. And I was cunning enough not to have it on my head, because I wouldn't ask any questions except by myself. Sometimes if there was anything I wanted to know, I'd wait until he was just going out of the room or something, and I'd sidle up and say, react so impatiently then, but quite a few times until Francis was going out of the room or until I caught him by himself, and then I'd say, I'd tentatively put my question because I was full of questions too, you see, and he didn't seem to. I'd say, never again, I can't, this isn't love, and, that's not the way one should speak to one's fellow people, you see. But I couldn't stay away, up until about Wednesday. I was never going, no, I'm not going down there on Saturday. No, I'd be having conversations with myself. And then Thursday I wouldn't be quite so definite about it. And Friday I'd be wavering. And Saturday morning I'd be going through my chores for dear life so I could get down there in time, It was just, of course, it was Barbara's love, I realised, just the magnet that, irrespective of the channel that it came through, just as if I were on a string, pulling. And sometime during those Saturday afternoons, Francis said, I don't know whether in answer to a question or what, but he said that people have often commented on the apparently odd kind of people that Barber chooses to do his work, not the sort that anyone would imagine, not anything else, you see, but that. And Barber said that it isn't the kind of person that one is in what we call a kind of person, but their efficiency as a channel for him to work through, and that's his only thing for choosing people, is whether he can get his message through them or not. And of course I felt better about Francis, and of course it wasn't very long before I came to love him very much, not only with gratitude that, it had been through him, because Francis at this time was busy telling us that we'd never see Barbara. It was unfortunate, but the time had passed. But at least we had the satisfaction of knowing that he was still on earth when we heard about him. But and I used to say, that's no good to me. I'm not going to be living on the earth here and know that he is there, when I've often thought, fancy if you'd become of Jesus, and here I am and not see him. I'm going over and I'll just look through the hedge. And Francis said, that won't do you any good. What's the good of that? That won't get you anywhere spiritually. And I said, I don't care. I just want to see him, that's all, just so that I've actually seen him. I don't want him to talk to me or do anything, just for me to see him. So, of course, it wasn't very much longer, very many years went past before the 56 visit was being hinted at, and then...
And Barbara would be coming?
Yes, coming to Sydney, to this place that Francis and all of us had been. That was fantastic, fantastic news. And in due course he came. I don't think anything, that was about 3 years after I'd met him. Right? It was 3 years after I first heard of him that I actually saw him. And then, of course, there was a terrific excitement for months while we were getting everything ready, the places where everyone would sleep and camp, and all the barber quarters in the big house, which is now the big room at Meher House. And then finally, I saw him, and he said he came in the afternoon. Barber came in 1956. It was afternoon, and he had sent a message that I think from the airport or somewhere, I'm not sure, that he wouldn't be seeing us, or before then, he wouldn't see us in that day because they were all tired and he wanted to rest and so on, and so that was all right. We were quite happy to think he was there. But of course, after he'd been there about an hour or maybe less, I forget, there was all great excitement. Francis running down, come on, Barber's coming out, you're all going to meet Barber. And he came out and stood on the stone steps outside Meher House, and we all filed past, and he embraced us, and of course we were all watching, looking at him while the other first people were in front of us, having their turn. And, I'd love to say, like some people, my heart lurched, or a great feeling swept over me. I think it'd be wonderful to have that sort of experiences, but to me, there he was, Barber in the flesh, everything I'd seen, heard and thought and read, there it was. It was, nothing. He was everything I'd hoped and expected and so on, but no great rush of this and that, you know. I suppose my first experience, and it's a very meagre, practical sort of a one, when we went in for our private interviews the next day, Barbara was sitting on one end of a couch and patted it to sit down, you see. And as soon as and then he starts asking questions, just a little personal, you know, you're married and you have how many children, how old's your child, so. And I'm sitting there and I'm trying to pay attention, but all the time I'm restraining. He's sitting on my left-hand side here, and there's about a foot of space, I suppose, between us, and my hand's sort of creeping over like this, and I'm looking at Barbara over here. Yes, Barbara. No, yes, so on. And all the time I'm having to use almost physical strength to keep it from rushing out and just grabbing hold of his clothing. That's all I could think about, really. My concentration on was grabbing hold of his sadra, I think, this soft white material, you see. I just wanted to clutch it tightly in my hand like that, you see. And it wasn't until, you know, I don't know when, but long afterwards, I think, I just thought this was how extraordinary, you know. I didn't like to do it because the reason I didn't just do what I wanted to and grab his clothing was a sort of feeling of awe, I suppose, or maybe a silly feeling of politeness, that it's not politeness to just grab hold of a person's clothing you've just met. You know, if I'd met him later, and I've often wished I had done it, and had it been on one of the subsequent meetings with him, I probably would. But it wasn't until long afterwards that I suddenly came to me in a flash. He was telling me inwardly to keep hold of his daemon, you see, but me being pragmatic, all I could do was to translate it absolutely literally, just grab hold of his thing. But of course it didn't occur to me that he was giving me the thought, hold on to my daemon, you see, or I would have done it literally as well. Anyway, they were wonderful days with him. I think it was 4 days there. Another time I remember of that visit, we were sitting in the big room at Meher House, and Barbara said it's a quiet time, everybody just be quiet and concentrate on him and look into his eyes, and then later on when you're meditating on him, try and recall this and just gaze into his eyes and drown yourself in them, kind of thing. Well, I tried to do it then, and I've tried to do it since. I do it, you know, when I'm going to sleep, I think of looking into his eyes and that, but I can't say that I really ever, unfortunately, have any experiences that I think are worth recording. Anyhow, then we went to Melbourne in the same plane with him, and he spent a couple of days was it 1 or 2 days in Melbourne, I forget which, and then back to Sydney again.
What was Barbara doing on the plane?
Well, he and the Mandalay were sitting in some little sitting room effect, or I don't know, I forget even what kind of a plane it was or anything, but there was a little, like you call it, a little saloon or salon or something, a little, what do you call it on a plane? Just the seats weren't all back to back like in the ordinary part. There was this little space with seats, and Barbara and the Mandalay were sitting there. I don't even know the kind of plane it was or anything else. And quite a crowd of us were in the plane, and there were some strangers as well. It wasn't only Barbara people.
Was Barbara, did he say anything to you aboard the plane when you were traveling?
No. As I remember, Francis was sitting with him, I think. But, you know, my memory is so vague now that I really don't remember. I've got the picture of him sitting there with the Mandalay at the back of the plane, but that's all. And then in Melbourne it was the same as in Sydney, you know, the group meeting and then interviews.
Tell us a little bit about the group meeting as to what went on.
Irwin, I don't really remember. All my only recollection, I mean, it's 20 years ago now, and I'm getting on in years. We were allowed to, some of us were given the jobs of cooking food for Barbara, which of course was terrific honour. I remember May Lundquist cooked the fish because she cooks fish very beautifully, and Francis said, now what do you do? And she told him how she cooked it, and he said, that's all right, after I gather he conferred with Barbara or the Mundley about it. And I was given the great joy of cooking the spinach for Barbara, and Francis said, now you must just put a little tiny bit of salt with it. I think he said salt, I don't remember, but a little butter, and put it through the sieve. And so I'm doing it, and I did, and I think, oh, spinach, it must have a couple of drops of lemon juice. I'll make it especially nice for Barbara. So I put a couple of drops of lemon juice in it. So it was all taken up. Francis took it all up, I think, took the food up, and in due course he came back with the plates, and with Barbara hardly ate any of anything, I don't think. And he said Barbara had said we were to eat it, the cooks were to eat it with as prasad from him, you see. And then he said, Diana, you cooked the spinach, didn't you? And I said, yes, Francis. And he said, what did you put in it? I told you exactly how to cook it, And I said, well, I just thought a couple of drops of lemon juice would make. And then he gave me a lecture which was a terrific lesson to me, and really I learnt a lot from it, because although he'd always, in all his talks with us, had told us about implicit obedience and all this sort of thing, but, you get carried away and think you'll make it just a little bit better, and of course, that's the thing, that obedience is just doing exactly what you're told to do, no less, but no more either. It's just as disobedient to add your own little personal egotistical touches, and I suppose that's what it was. You see, I was thinking, I'll make this extra nice, So that was a big lesson I learned. Can't think of anything else to say about then. Irwin, in case there are other people listening of my vintage, I don't remember very much of any. I met Barbara in 61 in India too. He was having a service as I happened to be going through India on my way back. Oh, this is a funny little story, really. Barbara was in one of his periods of very strict seclusion when no one was allowed to write to him, and no letters from Australia. Usually, well, we hadn't written to Barbara, of course, but we wrote to Francis, and any letters that he felt worthwhile were read out to Barbara, you see. But at this particular period, he wasn't allowed to read any letters even from Barbara, you see, nothing. There was to be no contact between us and India at all. So Francis told me afterwards I'd written an aero to him, and I'd carefully arranged my journey back from England to be going through the ship to stop at Bombay and then stop at Ceylon too, you see, which it did about 2 days later or something. And I said to Francis in an aero, I'm leaving on such and such and getting there and such. Do you think it would be because we'd heard that there was an Indian? Yeah. So there was some Indian. He was having a service for Indian people only, no foreigners. But I thought, well, it's worth a risk. So I sent an aerogram to Francis and said, my arrangements, you see, would it at all be possible, you see? So Francis told me this afterwards. He wasn't allowed to ask Barbara, but being very cunning, he folded the aerogram up and put it in the pocket of his shirt with his handkerchief, you see. And then when he was with Barbara and the Mundley in the hall, and Barbara talking to them or whatever, Francis gets his handkerchief out, you see, and of course the letter comes out and falls on the floor. And of course Barbara, you can just imagine him sort of knowing exactly, seeing through Francis like a book, but, in his lovingness sort of thing, going along with the joke, you see. So of course he says, oh, Francis, what have you dropped there? Oh, that's just a letter from Diana, says Francis, you see. And Barbara says, oh, what does Diana say? So then that's all right, you see. So Francis, oh, well, she's coming back on so-and-so, you see. And of course she wants to know, but I'll tell her that it's impossible. And no, tell her to come. Yes, that's quite all right. She can come with the others. Yeah. So I went up by train and I saw him. She can come for 5 minutes. 5 minutes, that's right. If she wants, she can come for 5 minutes, but then she has to pick up the ship again, Ceylon. Oh, yes. So that's exactly what happened. But of course, instead of 5 minutes, I had 2 or 3 hours in the afternoon. I got there, I think, about 4 o'clock or something. And then the next morning, Francis, I think it was, showed me. Baba had told him to show. Was it Francis or one of the other Mundley? I forget. Showed me. I think it was Francis. Took me around to see Baba Jan's tomb and the various places of interest in Deccan College and Baba's house in Pune where his family lived and so on, you see. But in all these, I started to say that in case there's someone else like me.
Just one thing.
Yes.
What happened during the 5 minutes? Or no, not
Well, a
3
couple of
hours.
hours. I sat on the floor with all the other people. Oh, yes. And after I'd been greeted Baba, of course, and so on, you know, embraced me and said to go and sit down. And then after about a half an hour, and he was greeting all these others, and there were a group of little Indian children, all beautifully dressed, who danced and sang, you know. And then he waved me into the room at the side where the women were. And that's the first time I met Mehera. I'd met Mani, had I? This was in 61. No, of course not. Hadn't met any of them then. This was before the East-West gathering, you see. And they were all, 3 or 4 of the women were in there, and they showed me their Baba treasures and things, you know, and I had some time talking to them. It was lovely. And then I think I saw him the next morning, or the next afternoon when I had to catch the train. Francis put me on the train, and that was that. Well, then again at the service in the East-West gathering in 62, I saw him.
But one thing.
That was the last thing, yes. In all the times that I saw Baba, and spent hours really, when you add them all together, in his company, I can't remember hardly any of the discourses he gave.